If you found this reader's guide helpful, please consider pledging your support to Voice of Geekdom on Patreon and gain access to premium content. Last time on the Silmarillion Explained, we read about Fingolfin's ride alone through the Anfauglith to the gates of Angband, where he smote upon the doors in anger and challenged Morgoth to single combat. Morgoth came to the surface and answered the challenge of the King of the Noldor, and the two fought an epic duel in front of the gates. Fingolfin dodges the blows of Grond, the mighty hammer of the underworld, and wounds Morgoth 7 times with his sword Ringil. Eventually the king tires, however, and Morgoth bears down on him with his shield, and crushes him under his gigantic boot. Fingolfin strikes him one final time with his sword, and then dies. Fingolfin's body is recovered by Thorondor, the king of the Eagles of Manwë, before Morgoth could defile it, and he carries it away to the encircling mountains around Turgon's Gondolin. This leaves Fingon, the elder brother, to replace his father as High King of the Noldor. Hello Tolkien geeks! This video is going to be another reasonably lengthy one, and I know we've already spent a little while covering this chapter, but a lot of critical information is given to readers in chapter 18, information which is going to be important through to the end of the Quenta Silmarillion. I hope that many of you will watch to the end of this one, as the final passages of the chapter will feature the return of voice-acted character dialogue, and includes a very special guest narrator, to me at least, playing the role of Húrin of the House of Hador. We're picking up again with the continuation of the story of Barahir and the people of the House of Bëor. After Barahir and his men saved Finrod from the orcs at the incident at the Fen of Serech, which we read about earlier in the chapter, and received the Oath of Felagund as gratitude for the rescue, Barahir returned to Dorthonion with his kindred, and they contested their former lands with the enemy. Then Morgoth pursued his people to the death, until few remained, and all the forest of the northward slopes of that land was turned little by little into a region of such dread and dark enchantment that even the orcs would not enter it unless need drove them. And it was called Delduwath and Tower Nu Fawin, the forest under Nightshade. The trees that grew there after the burning were black and grim, and their roots were tangled, groping in the dark like claws, and those who strayed among them became lost and blind, and were strangled or pursued to madness by phantoms of terror. Just like Ardgalen's renaming to Anfauglith at the start of the chapter, more or less, Dorthonion has now become Tower Nu Fawin. In response to the horror which had now become of their forest home in the Highlands, Barahir's wife, one Emeldir the Man-Hearted, leads the refugee women and children away from their former lands of Dorthonion and Ladros, and some of them settle in the forest of Brethil with the Haladin, the folk of Haleth, while others pass through the mountains into Dor-Lómin, which is now ruled by Galdor, the son of Hador, after his father's death in the Dagor Bragolac, which we've covered. This whole section lists off a lot of names in quick succession, and this can seem confusing to newcomers to the Silmarillion, especially as several of these names are quite similar to one another. No surprise there. So allow me to attempt to parse this all a little for you. The first two fairly important newly introduced names here would be Rian and Morwen, particularly the latter, Morwen, about whom several later stories will be told. Rian is introduced here as the daughter of Belagund, and Morwen as the daughter of Baragund. Belagund and Baragund were the sons of Bregolas, who was killed earlier in the chapter in the first fighting at Dorthonion in the Dagor Bragolac. Bregolas, Rian and Morwen's grandfather, was Barahir's elder brother, and he was the previous and final Lord of Ladros, and was leader of the House of Bëor up until his death. But you can put most of these names aside for now, particularly if this is indeed your first read-through. Belagund, Baragund, Bregolas. These character names are mere trivia in the vast and intersecting family trees of the Edain, ultimately. These ladies of the House of Bëor, though, Rian and Morwen, are the relevant new characters here in these first few passages which we are covering. Rian and Morwen were amongst those that entered the land of Dor-Lómin at this time, which you will recall was the land given to the House of Hador by Fingolfin, as we were told in the previous chapter, and these two young women will both go on to have very important and notable children. Children who will shape the future of the world, heroes of the Edain. We'll get much more on that later on, and I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves, but I just wanted to note that now. Meanwhile, in Dorthonion, the fighting men of the House of Bëor, led by Barahir, did battle against Morgoth's armies together, as I've said, and they were never seen again by these women and children who had fled with Emeldir. For these were slain, one by one, until at last only 12 men remained to Barahir, Beren his son, and Baragund and Belagund his nephews, the sons of Bregolas, and 9 faithful servants of his house, whose names were long remembered in the songs of the Noldor. Rathruin and Dairwin they were, Dagnir and Ragnar, Gildor and Gorim the Unhappy, Arthad and Urthel, and Hathaldir the Young. Outlaws without hope they became, a desperate band that could not escape and would not yield, for their dwellings were destroyed, and their wives and children captured, slain, or fled. This concept of the band of outlaws fighting together to the last, without hope of victory, strongly recalls the concept of northern courage again, which I talked about in the previous video. Once you know how important that concept was to Tolkien, it's very difficult to unsee it in every story in the Silmarillion, from now until the end of the book. The courage of Barahir and his men is a different type of thing to Fingolfin's challenge to Morgoth, though, less solitary and fatalistic. These are not elves. One can easily imagine that last group of men of the House of Bëor keeping one another's spirits in the fight, with camaraderie and wartime fraternity, and perhaps a splash of the gallows humour of soldiers in bleak and desperate times. Not to downplay the grimness of their fight against the enemy, which is exactly as hopeless as the narrator states it to be, but the plight of the men of the North is not that of the Eldar exactly. There is no doom of Mandos foretelling an ominous and miserable future for men. And Barahir and his 12 men, for now, hold to each other and continue to fight. We'll pick up this story thread again at the beginning of the next chapter. Meanwhile, although the Gap of Maglor in the east was overrun, the Noldor still held the western pass through the Vale of Sirion, and Orodreth was lord of Minas Tirith. And no, you didn't mishear that. That's the original Minas Tirith, which was built upon the island of Tol Sirion, in the middle of that pass. This was the tower that Finrod had built soon after the return of the Noldor, before he came south and built Nargothrond at the command of Ulmo, at which point the tower on Tol Sirion passed to the stewardship of Orodreth. Here in the Silmarillion, Orodreth is listed as the brother of Finrod, as well as the recently deceased Angrod and Aignor, and of Galadriel, of course. He hasn't been mentioned very much up until now, though. In later redrafts, in the latter years of the author's life, Orodreth is listed as the son of Angrod, and therefore the grandson of Finarfin, rather than as a fifth child. Christopher declared with certainty in The Peoples of Middle-earth that this was actually his father's final intention for this character. Interestingly, it may also have been Tolkien's intention to rewrite the Silmarillion to make Gil-galad the son of Orodreth rather than the son of Fingon, though Christopher is less certain on this point. Orodreth will show up in subsequent stories, and I'll continue to refer to him as the son of Finarfin and brother of Finrod Felagund and the others, but it's worth mentioning that you may sometimes see that alternate version which moves him down a generation in the family trees, referred to in other sources. I'll stick to the Silmarillion version of events for the sake of consistency, of course. So anyway, let's pick up the story again. 2 years after the Dagor Bragolak, Sauron, then a lieutenant of Morgoth, and not yet the Dark Lord that we know in the later parts of the timeline, attacked and captured Tol Sirion, Orodreth's original Minas Tirith, as we've said. At length, after the fall of Fingolfin, Sauron, greatest and most terrible of the servants of Morgoth, who in the Sindarin tongue was named Gorthauer, came against Orodreth, the warden of the tower upon Tol Sirion. Sauron was become now a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength, misshaping what he touched, twisting what he ruled, lord of werewolves. His dominion was torment. He took Minas Tirith by assault, for a dark cloud of fear fell upon those that defended it, and Orodreth was driven out and fled to Nargothrond. Then Sauron made it into a watchtower for Morgoth, a stronghold of evil and a menace, and the fair isle of Tol Sirion became accursed, and it was called Tol Ingauroth, the Isle of Werewolves. Sauron's invasion of Tol Sirion sets up his role in the Beren and Luthien story, which is coming up in the very next chapter. The list of titles and properties which are ascribed to Sauron here are mostly self-explanatory. His description as a sorcerer of dreadful power should seem obvious and broadly consistent with the Sauron of the Lord of the Rings and with the necromancer who was mentioned in The Hobbit. Similarly, Master of Shadows and Phantoms should certainly seem familiar too. In the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. There's a very clear association with shadows and Sauron. But what about foul in wisdom? At first glance, this might seem like a little bit of an oxymoron. Wisdom is a word that generally has positive connotations for most readers. I would draw a connection from Tolkien's use of the word wisdom to the Germanic roots of the word. In a nutshell, if one delves into its etymology, wisdom has had, in the past, a broader definition than the generally accepted meaning. It could also refer to knowledge, cunning and skill, as opposed to its more common modern usage, meaning sound judgment, insight and experience. And as for, in this list here, Lord of Werewolves, well, you'll have to wait until the next chapter for me to cover that topic in full. We get a lot more of Sauron and his Isle of Werewolves in Of Beren and Luthien. Following Sauron's capture of Tol Sirion, Morgoth controls both of the main passes through the mountains leading into Beleriand, and the orcs continue to come south and raid the lands of both the Eldar and Edain. Though Doriath is still shut to them due to Melion's magical barrier, and the locations of Nargothrond and Gondolin are still hidden, Morgoth takes prisoners of the elves and enslaves his captured enemies, turning many of them into thralls to his will, and then releasing them to unleash fresh mayhem, betraying their own peoples. Distrust and paranoia begin to spread amongst the Noldor due to Morgoth's insidious tactics. Morgoth found it difficult, though, to ensnare the Edain and corrupt the noble elf friends to his service, and so instead he sent messengers east over the mountains and sought servants from among the Easterlings, who first entered Beleriand at this time. The Easterlings, here referred to as the Swarthy Men, are a different group to the Easterlings of the Third Age that we meet in The Lord of the Rings. The Balerion Easterlings were a diverse group of many different houses, and yes, on average of a darker skin colour apparently. But the sons of Feanor made an alliance with some of them, and took 2 of those houses into their service, much as the House of Fingolfin had done with the House of Hador, we can suppose. This arrangement was a ruse, however, one which had been planned by Morgoth. Maedhros, knowing the weakness of the Noldor and the Edain, whereas the pits of Angband seemed to hold store inexhaustible and ever renewed, made alliance with these new-come men, and gave his friendship to the greatest of their chieftains, Bor and Ulfang. And Morgoth was well content, for this was as he had designed. The sons of Bor were Borlad, Borlak and Borthand, and they followed Maedhros and Maglor, and cheated the hope of Morgoth, and were faithful. The sons of Ulfang the Black were Ulfast and Ulwarth, and Uldor the Accursed, and they followed Caranthir and swore allegiance to him, and proved faithless. We'll read more about the circumstances of the betrayal of the Easterlings, which is referred forward to in this last passage in a couple of chapters' time. I will just say at this juncture, however, that it makes sense that of those 2 houses of the Swarthy Men of the East, it was the house that followed Maedhros and Maglor that was inspired to loyalty to the Eldar in the end, and who are still remembered with honour, and those that followed the cruel and supercilious Caranthir, who betrayed the elves and fell into the service of Morgoth. Who would you rather follow into battle? Not that I'm making excuses for the vile Ulfang and his sons, and I don't mean to keep dumping on Caranthir unnecessarily, but it is interesting that one of those houses stayed faithful, while the other did not. The people of Haleth, at the time of the Dagor Bragolach, were now ruled by Halmir, who was, if you're wondering, the great-nephew of the legendary warrior Haleth from the previous chapter. The Haladin still kept a watchful vigilance over the forest of Brethil, both before and after the fall of Tol Sirion at the hands of Sauron. Shortly before the Dagor Bragolach, though we're just being told of it now, a great feast was held where the houses of Haleth and Hador had been joined together, in a move which is very much reminiscent of real-world medieval feudal politics, in a double wedding between 2 pairs of the respective children of the incumbent lords of those houses. Galdor, the son of Hador, and therefore heir to Dor-Lómin, was married to Hareth, the daughter of Halmir, the Lord of Brethil, and Glorethel, the daughter of Hador, was married to Haldir, the son of Halmir. Another set of names which are not massively important for readers to remember, with the exception of Galdor, son of Hador, and even in his case only up until the end of the chapter, really. However, the important upshot of this double marriage is that Húrin and Huor, the sons of Galdor and Hareth, and grandsons of the legendary Hador, were fostered in Brethil by their uncle, and thus living there amongst the Haladin at the time of the Dagor Bragolach. In the wake of the conquest of Tol Sirion, a legion of orcs from Angband marches south and threatens Brethil, and ultimately Doriath itself. Halmir of the Haladin raises a force to face them, and together with the Marchwardens of Thingol, who were led by the great Beleg Strongbow, they ambushed and defeated a great host of orcs and utterly destroyed them. After that defeat, though they continued to hold the pass, the orcs of Angband feared to cross the river Teglin for some years afterward, and Doriath and Nargothrond were spared for now from further assault in force from the western flank. In that battle, though, Húrin and Huor, the young sons of Galdor, accompanied the Men of Brethil to oppose the orcs, but they became separated from the main host, and this is where we'll read on from. Being with a company that was cut off from the rest, they were pursued to the ford of Brethil, and there they would have been taken or slain, but for the power of Ulmo, that was still strong in Sirion. A mist arose from the river and hid them from their enemies, and they escaped over the Brethil into Dimbar, and wandered among the hills near the sheer walls of the Chrysaegrim, until they were bewildered in the deceits of that land, and knew not the way to go on or to return. There Thorondor espied them, and he sent 2 of his eagles to their aid, and the eagles bore them up and brought them beyond the encircling mountains to the secret vale of Tumladen, and the hidden city of Gondolin, which no man yet had seen. The hidden valley was unaffected by the sudden flames from Angband, and the people of Turgon were still kept safe from assault by the protection that their seclusion continued to afford them. Húrin and Huor's coming to Gondolin, aided by Ulmo himself, is a moment of serendipity, but also of providence. Remember Ulmo's words to Turgon from chapter 15, that one day one shall come from Nevrast to warn Gondolin of its danger, and that beyond ruin and fire hope shall be born for elves and men. This isn't that moment, but it is the precursor to that moment, which is beginning to get closer at hand. There Turgon the king received them well when he learned of their kin, for messages and dreams had come to him up Sirion from the sea, from Ulmo, Lord of Waters, warning him of woe to come, and counselling him to deal kindly with the sons of the House of Hador, from whom help should come to him at need. Ulmo's attentiveness to the situation may seem striking, and it is certainly quite hands-on for him to intercede like this, and direct Turgon to receive Hador's young grandchildren with grace and magnanimity. But let us not forget that Manwë's eagles answer directly to the King of the Valar himself, and that their role here, in bringing Húrin and Huor to Gondolin, was equally instrumental. Amid all the turmoil and grief of that time, in the aftermath of the Dagor Bragollach and the fall of Fingolfin, this is beginning to look like the beginnings of a plan by the Valar to help to deliver the Noldor and the peoples of Beleriand from their evil plight. The brothers Húrin and Huor dwelt in Turgon's palace for about a year. In that time, they were said to have learned much of wisdom and lore from the elves and from the king. Turgon, for his part, was surpassingly fond of the sons of Galdor, and came to love them in that brief time. Presently, however, the 2 young men began to desire to return to live amongst their own folk once more. Húrin and Huor desired to return to their own people and share in the wars and griefs that now beset them, and Húrin said to Turgon,
"Lord, we are but mortal men, and unlike the Eldar. They may endure for long years awaiting battle with their enemies in some far distant day, but for us the time is short, and our hope and strength soon wither. Moreover, we did not find the road to Gondolin, and indeed we do not know surely where this city stands. For we were brought in fear and wonder by the high ways of the air, and in mercy our eyes were veiled."
Then Turgon granted his prayer, and he said, "By the way that you came, you have leave to depart, if Thorondor is willing. I grieve at this parting, yet in a little while, as the Eldar account it, we may meet again." But Maeglin, the king's sister son, who was mighty in Gondolin, grieved not at all at their going, though he begrudged them the favour of the king, for he had no love for any of the kindred of men, and he said to Húrin,
"The king's grace is greater than you know, and the law has become less stern than aforetime. or else no choice would be given to you but to abide here until your life's end."
Then Húrin answered him,
"The king's grace is great indeed, but if our word is not enough, then we will swear oaths to you."
And the brothers swore never to reveal the counsels of Turgon, and to keep secret all that they had seen in his realm. There's quite a bit to unpack here. Húrin's initial speech here in this last passage, comparing the situation of men with that of the elves, touches on an important theme, or rather undertone, to the Silmarillion. We've seen how the narration, with its elf-centric slant, demonstrates the sense of otherness with which the elves view the Edain, and men in general. Remember the long list of titles that the narrator gave to men when men first awoke with the rising of the sun from chapter 12. The usurpers, the strangers, and the inscrutable, the self-cursed, etc. It's clear that the elves, even those like Turgon or Finrod, who extend the hand of friendship towards the men within their orbit, see humanity as something of an enigma. Here we're getting dialogue from a man, and getting a little taste of what it's like when the shoe is on the other foot. Húrin is showing a good deal of wisdom and awareness here, actually. He's correctly intuiting Turgon's intent to remain out of the war, and to wait for some sign to take action. And you have to admire his keenness to return to the war and fight against Morgoth, and be accounted for his place in history, with the limited mortal life that is granted to him and to his brother. The other interesting thing about the contrast that's being highlighted here is that, despite the difference in lived perspectives between the races, it will take both kindreds of the children of Ilúvatar to finally defeat Angband. There are two romantic unions of man and elf who will be documented in the final chapters of the Quenta, and the eventual product of those unions will deliver the world from the evil of Morgoth. I really shouldn't say too much more than that at this juncture, as we're about to begin the first of these stories next time, as we approach chapter 19 together. Something should also be said about Maeglin's interjection here in this last passage. When the favoured prince of Gondolin objects to King Turgon's sympathy towards the two brothers, and his assent towards their leaving Gondolin to rejoin their people, the narrator explains that Maeglin had no love for any of the kindred of men. This is perfectly true on the face of it, and yet there is an unavoidable subtext to his words, when he also tells them that the king's grace is greater than you know, and the law is become less stern than aforetime, or else no choice would be given you but to abide here to your life's end. The last part of his proclamation of dissent here, abide here to your life's end, is almost a word-for-word recollection of what Turgon told Maeglin's own father, Eöl, in chapter 16, immediately before his attempted filicide, which resulted in the death of Maeglin's mother and the king's sister, Aradel. Maeglin could hardly be said to have been defending his father overtly, much less blaming his king for what had happened back then. And yet Turgon surely could not have missed the implication of Maeglin's words. Maeglin's feelings about the deaths of his parents, at this point in history, can only be speculated on. But this was a moment in which Maeglin's mask of careful civility falters, just for a moment. Whatever Turgon might have been thinking in this moment, he doesn't question Maeglin's motives further, and the oaths of Húrin and Huor are accepted when they are allowed to return to Dor-Lómin that same night, by the same means of transportation by which they arrived. The next quote is from just after they are flown back to Dor-Lómin by the eagles. Their kinsfolk rejoiced to see them, for messengers from Brethil had reported that they were lost, but they would not declare even to their father where they had been, save that they were rescued in the wilderness by the eagles that brought them home. But Galdor said, "Did you then dwell a year in the wild, or did the eagles house you in their eyries?" But you found food and fine raiment, and return as young princes, not as waifs of the wood." And Húrin answered,
"Be content that we have returned, and only under an oath of silence was this permitted."
Then Galdor questioned them no more, but he and many others guessed at the truth, and in time the strange fortune of Húrin and Huor reached the ears of the servants of Morgoth. It seems to me that the spies that Morgoth had sent abroad amongst the Noldor had a secondary purpose, a function of espionage other than sowing dissent and mistrust, the immediate effects of Morgoth's tactics, as we were told earlier in the chapter. In the closing passages of the chapter, we learn that Morgoth feared both Finrod and Turgon. He knew that the two cousins yet lived, but he had no idea of where they or their followers dwelt, or how strong they and their realms might be. Morgoth was still unaware of the location of Nargothrond, and Gondolin was such a well-kept secret that, as yet, he still did not even know of its existence. Turgon will continue to bide his time in his hidden vale in the mountains, heeding Ulmo's wisdom and warnings, and trusting to Gondolin's secrecy, waiting until the messenger and the sign appear that Ulmo had foretold to him long ago. However, the king was not entirely idle, and he reacted to the breaking of the siege by sending out ships and mariners into the west to ask the Valar for pardon and aid. None of the elves that he sent ever succeeded in navigating the enchanted shadowy seas, of course, which had cut Valinor off from the world after the exile of the Noldor, and few of them ever returned from the attempt. Though some of those that did make it back to shore will play a role in a later chapter, but we'll get to that in due course. Over the next 7 years, the Eldar were able to begin to regain much of the territory which they had lost in the Dagor Bragolac. The forces of Angband retreated again, though Sauron still remained entrenched in Tol in Gauroth. Morgoth had stretched his lines too far, too quickly, and his own losses in the fighting had also been substantial. On the 7th year after the breaking of the siege, however, Angband was able to gather a large enough force once again to launch a massive assault against Hithlum, and Galdor, the Lord of Dor-Lómin, was slain. Húrin, now a young but fully grown man, and already an incredible warrior, took command of the men of the House of Hador. The Orcs almost succeeded in overwhelming High King Fingon's army as well, until the ships of Círdan of the Falas sailed up the Firth of Drangist in the hour of the Noldor's greatest need. Their sudden arrival drove back the Orcs, who were then pursued by Fingon's archers all the way back to the Iron Mountains. Afterward, Húrin was made Lord of Dor-Lómin at the age of 21, and he took Morwen of the House of Bëor for his wife. That's Barahir's grandniece, who had fled Dorthonion with Emeldir the Man-Hearted. And that's where the chapter closes. I'd like to say a massive thank you, first of all, to my father, who provided the voice of Húrin right at the end of this chapter. He'll be back again in a couple of future chapters too. Please do share some kind words about his contribution and performance in the comments here, as I'm sure he'd appreciate reading that. Maeglin was again voiced by the wonderfully talented Chase Mullins, reprising the role from chapter 16, when this character was first introduced. You'll find all of his social links in the description below. Next time on the Silmarillion Explained, we will begin the first, and perhaps the best known, of Tolkien's 3 great tales, the romance and great adventure of the legendary heroes Beren and Luthien.
And my axe.
Thanks to the Axe Tier Patreon supporters. That's Erin M, Kelly the Jaded Shipwright, Arvedwi of Arnor, Joshua Boniface, A.N. Kreutzberg, and the newest axe wielder, my good friend Nessie, one of the co-hosts for my friends Here Be Dragons on YouTube. who just upped her pledge this month. Baruch Kazad, my friends, and thanks to everyone else who helps with supporting the channel. You guys keep me motivated.